The clock ticked loudly, or maybe that was just my nerves. I sat across from Amanda at the kitchen table, my hands gripping the edge so tightly my knuckles turned white. She glanced up from her phone, irritation flickering across her face. "What's going on, John? You've been weird all day." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I know, Amanda, about you and my dad." Her hand froze mid-scroll. For a moment, she looked at me like I'd spoken in another language. Then her face paled, and she set the phone down slowly. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice brittle. "Don't." I slid my phone across the table, the messages glaring back at her. Texts exchanged between her and my father. Intimate, damning. Her lips parted, but no words came out. A long silence stretched between us, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. She began, then stopped. Finally, she whispered, "John, How long?" I asked, cutting her off. She stared down at the table, twisting her hands in her lap. "A few months," she admitted. "A few months." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. "You were with my dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Saying it out loud made it feel more real, more horrifying. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean for it to." "You didn't mean for it to?" I snapped, standing abruptly. "Amanda, he's my father. How does this even happen?" Tears streamed down her face, but I didn't care. "Not now. John, please, I love you. It didn't mean anything. I swear." "Love me?" I laughed bitterly. "You call this love?" I grabbed my keys from the counter, the weight of betrayal suffocating me. "I need air," I muttered, storming out the door before she could say another word. Outside, the cool night air hit my face, but it did little to clear my head. Her words echoed in my mind, tangled with images I couldn't shake. Amanda laughing at my dad's jokes, lingering glances at family dinners, her sudden desire to help him with things she never cared about before. I walked aimlessly, rage and disbelief warring inside me. Tomorrow, I'd have to confront him, my father, the man I'd trusted most. But tonight I just needed to breathe. The next morning, I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the floor as sunlight filtered through the blinds. Amanda hadn't slept in our room. I didn't know, or care, where she'd ended up. My head throbbed with the weight of sleeplessness and the ache of replaying the last few months in an endless loop. It hadn't started with suspicion. That's the part that killed me the most. I'd trusted her. I trusted him. I leaned back, pressing my palms into my face, and tried to pinpoint when the cracks in the facade had first appeared. It was late September when I first noticed Amanda acting different. She'd started keeping her phone closer, tucking it into her pocket instead of leaving it on the counter like she used to. I didn't think much of it. People change habits, I told myself. The first real flag was the night she came home late from running errands. She was jittery, flushed, and unusually quiet. When I asked where she'd been, she gave me this weirdly vague answer. "Oh, just Target. Got caught up looking at stuff." I remembered laughing at how stereotypical it sounded. Target, right? It was so banal that I didn't question it. A week later, we were at my parents' house for dinner. Dad was his usual charming self, laughing loudly, making toasts, telling stories we'd all heard a dozen times. Amanda was unusually quiet that night, sipping her wine and avoiding eye contact with me. I chalked it up to a bad mood until I caught something out of the corner of my eye, Dad's hand brushing hers as he passed her the breadbasket. It was subtle, quick enough that I might have imagined it. But Amanda's reaction, pulling her hand back and laughing nervously, stuck with me. After dinner, she volunteered to help clean up. That wasn't unusual. Amanda liked to pitch in. What was unusual was her asking me to stay in the living room with my brothers. "You guys catch up," she said, her tone almost too casual. I didn't think much of it then. Now it made me sick to my stomach. A few weeks later, the excuses started piling up. "I have a work thing tonight." "Don't wait up." "Your dad needed help organizing some files." "I'll be back in a couple of hours." "I'm meeting a friend for drinks." "Just a girls' night." At first, I believed her. Why wouldn't I? But then came the night I decided to check her phone. I wasn't proud of it. Snooping felt wrong, invasive, but something had been gnawing at me for weeks. She was in the shower when I found it. A message from Richard. My father. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. I stared at the words, my blood turning cold. My hands shook as I scrolled through their chat history, reading a string of flirtatious texts, inside jokes and plans to meet up. It was all there, laid out like a confession. I sat on the edge of my bed now, still haunted by that moment. I should have confronted her immediately, but I didn't. Instead, I started watching them, Amanda and Dad, at family gatherings, during casual visits, even in passing conversations. The signs were there, clear as day now that I knew where to look. The way Amanda laughed just a little too hard at his jokes. The way Dad complimented her, so often it bordered on excessive. What gutted me most was how they seemed to think I was blind, that I wouldn't notice. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, dragging me out of my thoughts. It was my mom, Lorraine. Hey, Mom, I answered, my voice hoarse. Hi, sweetheart. Just checking in. You and Amanda okay? You didn't look too happy at dinner last week. Dinner last week. The night, I'd caught them exchanging a glance across the table. A glance that said more than words ever could. Yeah, we're fine, I lied, my chest tightening. You sure? You know you can talk to me if something's wrong. I almost told her. The words were right there, perched on the tip of my tongue. But how could I tell her that her husband, the man she'd been married to for 35 years, was sleeping with her daughter-in-law? I'm fine, Mom, I said instead. Just busy with work. Okay, she said, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. Well, take care of yourself, honey. I love you. Love you too, I said, hanging up before the guilt could consume me. I spent the rest of the day preparing for what I knew had to happen next. Confronting Dad wasn't just inevitable, it was necessary. I couldn't let this sit any longer. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I'd made up my mind. Tomorrow, I'd face him. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than usual. Every mile stretched under the weight of what I was about to do. My palms were sweaty on the steering wheel, and I kept rehearsing different ways to start the conversation. None of them sounded right. When I pulled into the driveway, my dad's truck was parked in its usual spot, gleaming in the early afternoon sun. He loved that truck, the way he loved everything about his perfectly curated life. The house, the lawn, the spotless reputation as a family man. I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the front door. The house hadn't changed in years. Same beige siding, same American flag fluttering by the porch, same hydrangeas my mom fussed over every spring. It was the backdrop of my childhood, a place that should have felt safe. Now, it felt like enemy territory. Dad was in the garage when I walked in. He was leaning over his workbench, fiddling with a set of tools, humming a tune I didn't recognize. For a second, I just stood there, watching him. Hey, Johnny, he said without looking up. What brings you by? I hated when he called me Johnny. It always felt patronizing, like he was reminding me I'd always be his kid, no matter how old I got. We need to talk, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He turned, wiping his hands on a rag. That sounds serious. It is. His smile faltered. What's going on? I took a step closer, crossing my arms to keep them from shaking. I know, Dad. He blinked, confused. Know what? About you and Amanda. There it was. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. John, don't, I snapped, cutting him off. Don't even try to explain it away. I've seen the messages. He didn't deny it. That was what hit me hardest. He just nodded slowly, like he'd been waiting for this moment. Look, I'm not proud of what happened, he said, his tone measured, almost rehearsed. It was a mistake. A mistake? I repeated, my voice rising. You've been sleeping with my wife, Dad. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. Over and over again. He winced but held his ground. I'm sorry, John. I never meant to hurt you. Really? Because you've done a hell of a job at it. I stepped closer, my hands curling in a fist at my sides. How could you do this to me? To Mom. At the mention of Mom, his face crumpled for the first time. She doesn't know, he said quickly. And she doesn't need to. I laughed bitterly. Of course that's what you care about. Keeping your little secret. Protecting yourself. It's not just about me. He shot back, his voice firm now. This would destroy her. And you. Don't you dare make this about me, I snapped. You made this mess, Dad. You. He sighed again, leaning back against the workbench. For the first time, he looked his age, gray at the temples, lines etched deep into his face. I never wanted it to go this far, he said quietly. But it did, I said, my voice cold. And now you have to deal with it. We stood there in silence, the hum of the garage light the only sound. I wanted to yell, to throw something, to make him feel the pain I was carrying. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. I'm telling Mom, I said finally. John, wait, he said, stepping toward me. Please just think about this. It's not going to help anyone. It'll only hurt her. She deserves to know, I said, my voice trembling with anger. You don't get to decide that. John, he reached out, but I stepped back, shaking my head. You're not the man I thought you were, I said, my voice breaking. And honestly, I don't know if you ever were. I turned and walked out, ignoring his calls for me to stop. In the car, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly it felt like it might snap. I didn't drive away immediately. Instead, I stared at the house, my mind a blur of rage, heartbreak, and something else I couldn't quite name. He didn't even fight for his innocence. He didn't deny it. That, more than anything, told me all I needed to know. Tomorrow I'd tell Mom. But tonight, I needed to figure out how to pick up the pieces of everything he'd broken. When I told Amanda I was going to see my mom, her face drained of color. She didn't ask why, but her eyes followed me the way someone watches a storm rolling in. I didn't bother explaining. I was done explaining anything to her. My mom, Lorraine, was in the garden when I arrived, kneeling in the dirt and humming softly. She looked up as I approached, smiling warmly. John, what a nice surprise, she said, brushing her hands on her gardening gloves. You caught me in the middle of the hydrangeas. They're finally blooming right this year. She stood, a streak of dirt on her cheek, and pulled me into a hug. For a moment, I didn't know how to start. How do you break someone's heart? Mom, I said, stepping back. My voice felt foreign to me, low, unsteady. I need to talk to you. Her brow furrowed, and she tilted her head slightly. What's wrong, sweetheart? I gestured toward the porch. Can we sit down? We settled into the wicker chairs, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the yard. Mom sipped from her iced tea, watching me closely. You're scaring me, she said softly. Is something wrong with you, Aunt Amanda? I swallowed hard. Yeah, Mom, something's wrong. I took a deep breath, my gaze fixed on the peeling paint of the porch railing. There's no easy way to say this, so I'm just going to come out with it. Amanda and Dad, they've been seeing each other. The words hung in the air, sharp and jagged. Mom blinked, her smile frozen in place, as if she hadn't quite heard me. What? She whispered. I forced myself to look at her. They've been having an affair. Her iced tea slipped from her hand, shattering against the porch floor. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me with wide, disbelieving eyes. Mom, I said, leaning forward, I'm so sorry. I didn't want you to find out this way, but I couldn't keep it from you. You deserve to know. Her hands trembled in her lap, and she shook her head slowly. No, she said, her voice barely audible. No, that can't be right. Your father wouldn't. He wouldn't. I reached out, touching her arm gently. I saw the messages, Mom. It's true. She let out a shaky breath, her face crumpling. How long? Amanda said a few months. I said, my throat tightening. But who knows if that's the truth? Her tears came then, silent and steady, and it broke something in me to see her like that. This wasn't the strong, composed woman who raised me. This was someone shattered, blindsided by the man she thought she knew. For a while, neither of us spoke. I stayed by her side, letting her cry, wishing I had the words to make it better. But there were no words for this. Finally, she wiped her eyes, her voice steadier than I expected when she said, Does anyone else know? No, I said. Just us? She nodded, staring out at the yard, her expression hardening. He needs to leave. I blinked, taken aback. What? When he gets home tonight, she said, her voice firm now, I'm going to tell him to pack his things. He's not staying in this house. Mom, are you sure? I asked. Her eyes flashed with something I hadn't seen before, fury. He betrayed me, John. He betrayed you. There's nothing to think about. That evening, I stayed for dinner, though neither of us ate much. Mom insisted she'd be fine, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I wanted to be there when Dad came home, even if part of me dreaded the confrontation. When the sound of his truck pulling into the driveway reached us, Mom's shoulders stiffened. She stood, smoothing her blouse, and glanced at me. "Stay here," she said. "Mom." "Please, John," she said firmly. "This is between me and him." I nodded reluctantly, watching as she stepped outside to meet him. Through the window, I saw her speaking to him, her arms crossed, her posture rigid. He looked confused at first, then alarmed. He glanced toward the house, his mouth moving rapidly, as if trying to explain. Mom shook her head, pointing toward the truck. Dad's face crumpled, his shoulders sagging as he turned and walked back to the truck. He didn't come inside. When Mom returned, she looked exhausted but resolute. "He's gone," she said simply, sitting back down at the table. "What did he say?" I asked. She shook her head. "Excuses. Apologies. Promises it won't happen again. None of it matters." I reached across the table, taking her hand. "I'm proud of you, Mom." She gave me a small, sad smile. "Thank you, sweetheart. But this isn't over yet." I nodded, knowing she was right. The fallout had just begun. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I crashed on the couch in my old room at my mom's house, staring at the ceiling and listening to the echoes of the day's events. My phone buzzed on the coffee table every few minutes. Amanda, no doubt, but I didn't pick it up. Morning came with a harsh light, and as I shuffled into the kitchen, I found my mom already awake. She sat at the table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of her, staring into the distance. "You okay?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She glanced up at me and gave a small shrug. "Not really, but I will be." By the time I pulled into the driveway of my own house, I had prepared myself for the next confrontation. Amanda was waiting, her silhouette visible through the living room window. I didn't even have to knock before the door flew open. "John," she started, her voice trembling. "Please, can we talk?" I brushed past her, heading straight for the kitchen. She followed closely, her hands wringing nervously. "You've had your chance to talk, Amanda," I said coldly. "And everything you've said has been a lie." "It wasn't a lie," she shot back, her tone desperate. "I told you the truth, John. I made a mistake." A mistake?" I snapped, slamming my hand on the counter. "A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk. What you did was a deliberate choice. Every message, every meeting, you chose to do that, Amanda. With my father." Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know," she whispered. "I know I hurt you, and I hate myself for it. But I love you, John. I do." "Love me?" I scoffed, shaking my head. "You have a funny way of showing it." She reached for me, but I stepped back. "You don't get to do that," I said. "You don't get to cry and beg and pretend like this can all just go away." "John, please," she said, her voice breaking. "I made a mistake, but we can get past this. I'll do whatever it takes." I stared at her, a part of me tempted to believe her. But the image of her and my dad together, the lies, the betrayal, it was too much. "No," I said finally, my voice firm. "We're done, Amanda. There's no coming back from this." That night I packed a bag and left. The house that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a prison, each room tainted by her presence, her betrayal. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay. The next few days were a blur. I bounced between my mom's house and cheap motels, trying to figure out my next move. Amanda called and texted relentlessly, but I ignored every message. What I hadn't expected was the text from Dad. "We need to talk. Please." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "Fine. Your place. Tomorrow." When I arrived at Dad's condo the next evening, he was already waiting on the porch. He looked terrible, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "John," he said as I approached. I brushed past him without a word, stepping into the living room. The space was neat, almost sterile, but it still smelled faintly of his aftershave, a scent I used to associate with childhood comfort. "Say what you need to say," I said, crossing my arms. He sighed, sitting down heavily on the couch. I screwed up, he said simply. Yeah, I said bitterly. You did. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with regret. I don't expect you to forgive me, John. I don't want this to destroy our family. I laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Destroy our family? You already did that, Dad. He flinched, but I didn't let up. You didn't just betray Mom. You betrayed me. You broke something that can't be fixed. I know, he said quietly. And I'll live with that for the rest of my life. Good, I snapped. You should. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of everything unsaid hung in the air between us. I'm sorry, John, he said finally. For everything. Sorry doesn't fix this, I said, my voice cold. He nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. I know. When I left his condo, I felt lighter somehow, like I'd finally closed a chapter I'd been stuck in for too long. But the scars were still there, raw and aching. Back in the car, I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Amanda was gone. Dad was gone. And now, maybe, I could start figuring out who I was without them. I had imagined this chapter of my life ending with some grand catharsis. Shouting matches, slammed doors, maybe even a symbolic bonfire of everything Amanda and my father had ever touched. But real life doesn't hand you closure on a silver platter. Instead, it creeps up slowly, piece by piece. A week after I left the house, I was still staying in the same dingy motel, the kind of place with flickering lights and a vending machine that ate your quarters. Most nights, I stared at the ceiling or scrolled aimlessly through my phone, reading news articles I didn't care about. Then came a knock at the door. When I opened it, my mom was standing there clutching a manila folder like it was the key to everything. She looked tired, her face drawn and pale, but there was something in her eyes, determination, maybe anger, that made me step aside and let her in without a word. She sat at the tiny table near the window, dropping the folder in front of her with a thud. What's this? I asked, sitting across from her. Her voice was calm, but icy. I hired a private investigator. I blinked. You did what? She opened the folder, pulling out papers and photographs. I couldn't just sit around and wonder, John. I had to know the truth. All of it. What truth? I asked, my stomach tightening. Mom took a deep breath and began spreading the contents of the folder across the table. Emails, receipts, photographs. It was like a courtroom exhibit. Your father's affair with Amanda isn't the first time he's cheated. There have been others. I stared at the papers, my chest tightening. Others? Like who? She pointed to a name on one of the documents, a woman I didn't recognize. This one worked at his office about 10 years ago. And this one, she slid another photo across the table. She's a bartender at a place he frequented. Each revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. Dad's betrayal went far deeper than I'd imagined. The man I'd looked up to, the man I'd spent my whole life trying to emulate, was a fraud. How long has this been going on? I asked, my voice shaking. Mom's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. As far back as I can trace. The investigator said it's likely been happening for decades. For a while, we sat in silence, the weight of her words filling the small room. I flipped through the documents, unable to stop myself, even though every page only made me angrier. You're divorcing him, right? I finally asked, my tone sharper than I intended. She nodded. I've already started the process. Good, I said. He doesn't deserve you. She gave me a sad smile, her hand reaching out to cover mine. Neither of us deserve this, John. But we're going to be okay. Her words felt hollow at first, but as I sat there with her, something inside me shifted. She'd been dealt a devastating blow, yet here she was facing it head-on. If she could do it, so could I. A few days later, I packed up my things and moved into a small apartment downtown. It wasn't much, a one-bedroom with creaky floors and a view of the alley, but it was mine. It was a fresh start. Amanda tried to reach out a few times, leaving tearful voicemails and sending texts that ranged from apologetic to angry. I deleted them all without listening or responding. There was nothing left to say. The confrontation I dreaded most, though, was still ahead of me. My father had sent a handful of messages since I left, each one more desperate than the last. I need to see you. Please, let's talk. I know I've hurt you, but I can't lose my family. I ignored them at first, but the truth was I couldn't avoid him forever. If I didn't face him now, he'd keep trying to claw his way back into my life. So I finally agreed to meet him, neutral ground at the diner on the edge of town. When I walked in, he was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked older than I remembered, the weight of his actions etched into every line on his face. "John," he said as I slid into the seat across from him. "Don't," I said sharply, holding up a hand. "Let's skip the pleasantries." He nodded, clasping his hands together on the table. "I'm glad you agreed to meet." "I didn't do it for you," I said coldly. "I did it because I need answers." He sighed, looking down at his coffee. "I don't know what you want me to say. Try starting with why?" I snapped. "Why Amanda? Why anyone? Mom deserved better than this, and so did I." He flinched at my words, but didn't look away. "I don't have a good answer, John," he said quietly. "I was selfish. I made mistakes, and I'll regret them for the rest of my life." "Mistakes?" I said, my voice rising. "You call decades of cheating a mistake? You call sleeping with my wife a mistake?" He closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing himself against the weight of my anger. "I know I can't undo what I've done," he said, "but I want to make things right." I laughed bitterly. "Make things right? You think you can fix this? Dad, you destroyed our family. You destroyed me." His face crumpled, and for a moment I thought he might cry. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I know that doesn't mean much, but I am." "It's too late for sorry," I said, standing up. "You made your choices, Dad. Now you have to live with them." He didn't try to stop me as I walked out. Months passed. Mom finalized the divorce and moved into a smaller house closer to me. She threw herself into her garden, finding solace in the simple act of nurturing life. As for me, I started seeing a therapist, working through the anger and betrayal that had consumed me. Slowly, I began to rebuild. I found new routines, new friends, and a new sense of purpose. Amanda moved out of town not long after everything fell apart. I never heard from her again, and I was okay with that. One night, as I sat on the balcony of my apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I felt a strange sense of peace. The wounds were still there, but they weren't as raw. Life has a way of breaking you, but it also has a way of teaching you what you're capable of surviving. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could move forward. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.